This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to the Photographing the West podcast. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. This episode is brought to you by Flanagan Photos, and this is episode number 36. Today I have with me Marc Silber, photographer, videographer, producer, director, and educator. Welcome to the Photographing the West podcast, Marc. You're a busy guy.
Thanks, Kirby. And yeah, I'm also an app developer and an author. So I've got a few other hats I wear.
Yeah, forgot to add in the author part, so glad you mentioned it.
Sure.
So tell everybody about yourself as a photographer, an author, and videographer, and so forth.
Okay, well, I had the good fortune of going to a school here in California that really encouraged creativity. And like a lot of kids growing up at that time, I was shooting with a Brownie, and I'd take my rolls of film into the drugstore and I'd get them back and be very disappointed because they really didn't look like what I thought they should look like. And then in the seventh grade, my teacher said, "Hey, would you be interested in seeing how the darkroom works?" And I said, "Sure." I hadn't really no idea. I just thought it was kind of mystical process somehow, it turned it into pictures. We developed a roll of film, and that was cool. That was a neat thing, but it was when we put the negatives into the enlarger and made our first prints that the spark just went off, and I thought, wow, I can control this process. And instead of these muddy, totally drab looking small prints, I actually, I had an 8x10 with decent contrast. And all of a sudden, I'd say, Kirby, at that moment, I became a photographer. And by the 8th grade, I was actually selling my work, which technically would make me a professional. And I just kind of went on from there. I was always carrying a camera around with me, traveling in various interesting places. In Colorado, I went through Outward Bound, and I went through National Outdoor Leadership School in Wyoming, and went to Mexico on a backpacking trip by myself. Went through I was quite an explorer, and I had parents that kind of let me roam, which was handy. Built my own darkroom. So, my normal course of affairs, I'd be out photographing, and then I'd come back from one of these jaunts and just spend a couple of weeks in the darkroom making all the prints. And I just kind of grown up, with photography since then. I kind of went off on a different course, and I became a management consultant, believe it or not. And in 2004, I decided I've really got to connect back with photography. So I sold my consultancy and just jumped in headfirst back into the professional world of photography, and had to re-educate myself as a digital photographer, which I did. And it wasn't that difficult for me to make that jump. Certainly a lot easier to process your images in Photoshop rather than a darkroom where you're breathing in all those chemicals. And then I had the good fortune of meeting up with some of the world's best photographers, and I decided to produce a show called Advancing Your Photography, where we interviewed a whole wide spectrum of different photographers, from Ansel Adams' son to Chase Jarvis, Joe McNally, David Hobby, all these guys. And I was sponsored by SanDisk, so that was just a wonderful way to learn about photography. And more recently, in the last couple of years, I've put my attention more and more onto writing books, because videos are great, but you can't carry them around in your camera bag and refer to them whenever you need to. So that's where I'm lately putting most of my attention on writing. And, I'm still producing videos, but writing is probably my primary endeavor at this point. So there's a little thumbnail.
Yeah. Well, you've certainly had an interesting and varied career. You started out as an educator while you were at National Outdoor Leadership School, I guess, and is that how you got started?
Yeah, that is. I became an instructor when I was 19, and it's a challenge it's one thing to go off on an adventure and climb a mountain, but it's another thing to be responsible for a group of people. And that's sort of the test of fire because, you really want to make sure everybody comes back in the same condition that you started out in. So that's where I started as an educator, and I learned from the techniques of the school that everything was very exact. And if you taught a certain way and you had your students follow along with you, you could get a certain result, which is really the scientific method that, any good educational program follows. But that was how I started. And I've just found myself in an educational role ever since.
Interestingly, you made the leap into video very early in your career, certainly much earlier than most still photographers. What prompted that?
Well, I had to do it because I wanted to do these interviews, and I knew nothing about video. I didn't even, I wasn't even shooting home movies of my kids. So I was completely green in terms of video, and I jumped in and quickly learned that I needed to learn it. Even if I had skilled people on set with me, as a producer and director, I really had to know that I was controlling the shots. And then I learned to edit, which I love editing, and I love motion because as a still photographer, we learn our techniques of composition and that sort of thing. But when you're shooting video, and by the way, I call myself a digital filmmaker rather than a videographer, only because I feel like videographer to me is somewhat of a technician who's running around with a camera, where a filmmaker is actually creating stories and controlling the whole layers of things that go on in a film. But I learned that by editing, I became a better filmmaker and vice versa. So that was something I have enjoyed for the last 9 years or so. And I keep learning, and I find there's more and more tools and so forth to video that are becoming easier to use all the time.
Well, I wish I could say that I found video editing easy. I've just recently started, but it's been anything but easy. Yeah, indeed there is. So
just stay with it. And the thing I recommend, I use Adobe Premiere, and there's really good tutorials that accompany it. And if you follow the tutorial, you will come out the other end better able to edit. So that's my basic advice there.
Yeah, good to know. Yeah, that's what I'm using is Premiere Pro, and I thought it would be somewhat similar to Lightroom and Photoshop, but it's an entirely new learning curve I'm discovering.
Yeah, there are enough similarities, though. Like, for instance, in the color module, it's very similar to Lightroom. They actually changed it within the last 2 years, and you have your relatively easy sliders. Before, it was much more complicated. So at least you're taking advantage of some of the newer developments.
Yeah, well, sounds good. From that, you developed the Silber Studio. Is that how things went, or was it vice versa?
Well, yeah, Silber Studios, when I jumped back into photography in 2004, I founded Silber Studios, and I decided that I really needed to find the fastest route to make it a viable career. And so I kind of did everything. I did still photography. I didn't do weddings, but I did portraiture, magazine articles, photo essays, exhibits. And then I basically transitioned primarily into video production and did a lot of commercial work as well as my photography show. But most of my work was centered around interviews, because I found that even for a business to tell their story, the best way to do that would be to interview the top guy, the founder or the CEO, because, you can't fake that. It can't be just something that's written by a marketing department. What comes out of that person's mouth is their genuine story. And so I did a lot of those around, I'm in Silicon Valley. I did a lot of those for big companies in Silicon Valley. But, I have more or less retired from that. If I suppose if a big project came along that was interesting to me, I would probably consider it. But I've decided in the last year or two that my attention will be primarily put on my own work and things that I'm producing for myself rather than for other people. So that's kind of the change in the last few years. So that's why you'll find me mainly writing now and producing content that really is for my own, not for my own benefit, but about the work that I've done and that sort of thing.
And you mentioned that you're a podcaster also, but a video podcaster or vlogger, as they say these days.
Yeah, that's right. And that started from those early interviews. The first interview I did was actually the very first shoot we did was with Annie Leibovitz, who I went to art school with. So that was kind of cool. We shot her going through her exhibit in San Francisco, and then I had a chance to spend quite a bit of time with her. Unfortunately, my video team had left by then. It would have been fantastic footage, but they were gone. And then from there, Ansel Adams' son, Michael, invited us to come to Yosemite. And we went up to Yosemite and shot some interviews with him there. And then he invited me to come to his house, which was Ansel's house. And we did a tour through Ansel's dark room and work room, and that was spectacular. And then my next interview was with Chase Jarvis, who is the founder and CEO of Creative Live, which was great because I got to balance kind of last century photographers with this century photographers. And I basically produced the show ever since. So it's an ongoing, I guess you could call it a podcast, but it's an ongoing video show about photography called Advancing Your Photography.
Yeah, you had some interesting interviews as I looked through some of your work. So, and I have to say the quality of the video is outstanding. So I was impressed with that.
Thank you. Yeah, I've always felt that, if you're going to put these photographers into a video, you should make it look good, make them look good and have the quality be such that it could be utilized not just as a kind of a flimsy representation, but something that really would stand as a good model for how I feel that person should be portrayed. And that's where editing, careful editing comes in, and really getting a good story down, I think, is the key thing.
You still do your own editing, or?
I do, yeah. I don't do it all myself. I don't like to do all the little nitpicky stuff. So I always make sure I have somebody else who can do the finished editing. But the first thing I do when I shoot an interview or shoot any kind of film is I do the rough edit, because that's where the story really comes together. And it's funny because editing is mainly getting rid of stuff. So you can fall in love with a certain piece, something that the guest said that was really interesting. But then when I listen to it, and I go through it a number of times, and each time I'm trying to ask myself, do I need this in here? Is this really helping the story, or is it just something I like that doesn't really build any real interest or information? Because I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, if I were watching this video, what am I going to learn from this? So I find myself constantly cutting out stuff that just doesn't really help tell the story, which of course is true with still photography. And I get into that in my book in composition, that probably one of the biggest hurdles for a newer photographer is learning what to remove from a photograph. You can think all the time about what you want in the photograph, but so much of it has to do with eliminating things that are either going to be distracting or just don't add to the quality of the photograph. And the same thing is true with video editing.
Very true. So speaking of your book, is it out yet, or?
It is available on Amazon for pre-order. If you type my name, Marc Silber, make sure you spell M-A-R-C and S-I-L-B-E-R. You'll type it in, you'll see my books are in there, and it will be released on May 15th. But people who pre-order will have it shipped as soon as it becomes available.
Great. Interesting time looking through it, and it's very nicely done, I'd have to say. It goes well beyond the rule of thirds and all the other usual composition rules. What was your inspiration for the book?
Well, Kirby, over the years, I don't know how many times people have asked me, hey, how can I improve my composition? Because if you get right down to it, there's, once you know what your camera can do, and in today's world, even if you don't want to know that, you just take a smartphone out because these cameras are pretty smart. But once you know what your camera can do, there's only two other variables, and that's lighting and composition. Originally, this book was going to cover both, but, I got so deep into composition, I told my publisher, I said, look, this is like serving a full course, 5-course meal, and then taking a 5-minute break and then serving another 5-course meal. I said, we better just split this up here. So I took on composition because, first of all, believe it or not, nobody else has done this. I couldn't find any complete book on composition. It was usually part of something else. Like in my first book, I did have a section on composition, but this book is only about composition. And what I found is there's two kind of main schools of thought about composition. There's the Edward Weston school, which is there's no rules. You just sort of feel your way to what good composition looks like. So that on one extreme, and on the other extreme, there's nothing but rules. There's the rule of third, there's leading lines, there's all these different rules. And I found that the true answer was somewhere right in between, like most things in life. And the truth is there are no rules of composition. And a rule, if you think about it, like a law, like the law of gravity. If you let go of your camera, it's going to fall. That's gravity. And it's probably going to get broken. If you don't use the, quote, rule of thirds, you're not going to have your camera break. The photography police aren't going to give you a ticket. Nothing really is going to happen. It may or may not look good if you don't follow the rule. So I basically, rather than calling them rules, I call them guidelines, or even better, tools. There's plenty of photographs that have been taken in violation of the, quote, rule of thirds that look fantastic. The subject is right smack in the middle of the photograph. And there's others that it works perfectly. So I kind of also liken it to being a cook in a kitchen. If you know how to use your tools or your utensils, you'll be able to come away with a good meal. But people needed some guidelines to follow, and that's why I basically researched what are these different tools, and I wrote a description for each one and an example of each one, and dug as deep as I could find, not just in photography, but back into classical art. Because remember, photography didn't just develop in the last 20 years, 100 years. It really blossomed as a fine art subject about 100 years ago, but it came out of classical art. And the same rules or guidelines of composition that you find in classical art, of course, will apply to photography. So you'll see many examples of classical artists in my book. Da Vinci use of triangle, Rembrandt's use of the triangle, various different artists who use a technique, for instance, one called balance scale composition, where you have the subjects right in the middle being balanced by two other things, just like a scale would be. And that's a very pleasing compositional tool. So what this gives you is a vocabulary of composition. I think most photographers, I myself included in many cases, tend to shoot the same photograph over and over again, or maybe 5 or 6 of them. And I think that's only because we need to broaden our vocabulary. Joe McNally talks about the language of light, that you really have to view light as a language and understand how it works. And I believe that composition is the same. You have to get a vocabulary. And once you have that vocabulary, you can speak more fluently, just like learning a language. So what I'm presenting here are 83 terms, tools, or vocabulary words or concepts that you can use to express yourself as a visual artist.
And you also go on to talk about mixing and matching them. So that's a relatively new concept too, at least to me.
Well, yeah, a lot of times these will flow together. And if you'll see that many, again, in classical art, it isn't just one of these or another. It's usually several that are kind of working together. I'll give you for instance. So I went over a technique called mood lines, which is the second half of the book is about mood lines. What is a mood line? A mood line basically is a line that describes, or it really compels, a certain feeling or emotion. And it's very interesting. This was researched not by a photographer, but by a landscape architect. His name is John Ormsby Simmons. And he found that in his outdoor architecture, the way he designed an outdoor space, by the use of the lines, he could actually bring about certain emotions. And he researched these and documented them, and they have actually been used here and there in terms of graphic design, not so much by photographers. So I've known about these for quite a while, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to show an example of each one of these lines and how you can use it? So for instance, if you have a straight upright in your photograph, you can bring about the feeling of stability. And on the other hand, if something's leaning over, you can bring about a feeling of unstable, instability. So when you're communicating to someone, you're trying to use just the right word. Mark Twain said the difference between I'm going to paraphrase it, but the difference between the right word and the almost right word is a lightning bug and lightning. And so lightning bug, okay, that's kind of cool, but lightning, bang,
Right.
So if you have the right mood that matches what you're trying to get across, it really makes your photograph pop, and it really conveys the meaning that you're looking for. And that's why I found this is so important to understand these mood lines along with the other compositional tools, because then you've got a vocabulary, you've got a way of expressing yourself that can really broaden your photography.
Yeah, I found that fascinating. And I guess over the course of the years of doing photography, some of it I've learned by doing and some by reading here and there, but it's nice to have it all in one spot. And it certainly gives the person looking to improve their photography a major leg up if they understand and begin to use some of those guidelines or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, tools, guidelines, recipes. I hope so. And I'm hoping that more than one of the readers will take the challenge that I put in here in the book, which is, the book's going to be published in May. So we're coming up to summer. There's 83 tools. If you were to go out and photograph one of those every day over the course of the summer, by the end of the summer, you would have photographed them all. and hashtag them, put them on Instagram, hashtag them AYP Club, AYP Advancing Your Photography. So we can see, and I think that by doing that, you could really master the tools of composition over the course of one summer, which is not a bad investment. And I think it would be interesting to see the results.
Sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about your first book. I haven't had a chance to look at that. What was that all about?
So the first book is called Advancing Your Photography, and it really was an outgrowth of all these interviews. Something I figured out, a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, is what I call the cycle of photography. I was trying to see if there's a way that the different steps or stages of photography all kind of fit together. And I found out there is. So at the center of this cycle, and you'll see in the book, there's a visual of this, it's a circle. At the center of this circle is what's called visualization. And visualization is what Ansel Adams termed as the whole key to photography. And what he means is before you press the shutter, you should know what it is you're trying to create. Don't just randomly press the shutter, but know ahead of time what you want to say with your photograph, where you want to place your camera, what lens you're going to use, what f-stop you're going to use, how you're going to focus. All these different things should just basically come into your mind. I mean, it can come in there as a quick concept, but if you visualize first, you're going to come away with a much better aesthetic example of what it is you're trying to say. And one thing that can actually strengthen your ability to visualize is looking at others' work. Looking at classic art, for example, is a really great way to strengthen your visualization muscles. Go to museums. I really recommend, by the way, don't do this online. Don't do it digitally. Look at the actual, as close as you can get to it, the actual work of art, ideally hung on the wall, if not in a well-printed book, because you will learn from that what resonates for you. And if you take a really deep look, and I give an exercise in my book of how to do this with a painting by Vermeer. If you take a really deep look and look at how that artist used light, color, composition, where they place their subject, these are things you can incorporate into your own photography. And many of the great photographers that I interviewed said this is how they learned their photography, was by looking at classical art. So that's the first step. The next step is really getting to know your camera as a friend, and something that goes well beyond a mechanical object. Think of it as there's different photographers say it in different ways, but you should think of it as basically an extension of yourself, as your ability to capture that image. You need to know that camera really well. And then the next stage is called capture. Capture is a blend of visualization and using your camera, and that's where composition comes in. So how are you going to capture this image to tell the story that you want? Where are you going to stand? What compositional tools are you going to use? How is your lighting? All these things come under the heading of capture. And then the next stage of the process is processing or developing your image. And that also includes visualization, because you might have taken it with the idea that you want it to be a black and white. You look at it. My general rule of thumb, whether I use black and white or color, is if there's nothing important in the image color-wise, I tend to go black and white. I find it's, for me, and I was a black and white photographer, in the darkroom days, and I tend to go black and white unless there's some important color element. And then, of course, I'll keep it as a color photograph. But that's part of your vision. Black and white or color, how much contrast do I want? All your sliders in Lightroom or Photoshop, all those things come into play. And then the final stage of the cycle of photography, it's can't just sit on your computer. You need to share it with the world. And sharing goes into many different things. I'm not just talking about sharing on Instagram or Facebook. I'm talking about all the different ways that you can get your work out there. And one of those basic ways is make sure that you make prints of your best photographs. Don't just leave them, again, as a digital image. Get a print, frame it, put it on the wall. I mean, that's sort of the most fundamental aspect of any art form. And then from there, you can look at things like getting your work into exhibits, getting into magazines. We were talking about video editing. That's a fantastic way to use still photographs is in your videos. And you could do no worse, by the way, than to edit together your still photographs into a short video, which one of the things that's great about that is it kind of, if you go on a vacation, let's say, you can kind of put them all together with some music, maybe text or whatever, to tell that visual story. And maybe it's only 3 minutes, but it incorporates all your still work in it. So that whole cycle, starting with visualization and going all the way through, is what that book is about. And it has a lot of quotes from the interviews that I did over the years. And my good friends were generous in allowing me to not only quote them, but to use their fantastic photographs. So you'll see many, many photographs in there.
And you put all that into one book, huh?
I put it all into one book. It was a challenge, but
I guess
it could have been many volumes, but I decided that was enough for now.
Yeah. So do you have another book project going now, or where are you at with that?
I do. I actually have a couple going on. My next book is going to be called The Art of Living. And it kind of goes beyond photography, more into things I've learned from my research in these two books to applying these principles to your own life. Because, if you look at many artists had a very interesting life that was full of living life as an art form itself. And by that, I mean making life interesting and fun rather than kind of dull and boring the way, unfortunately, many people's lives go. But how can you elevate it as an aesthetic experience? And I've just begun that one, so I don't have a lot of specifics to tell you just yet, but if we check back in about 6 months, I'll probably have it done and can roll that one out.
Okay. You're going to figure all that out in 6 months?
I hope so. That's my challenge. How's that?
Yeah, indeed. So with all you've got going on, do you still have time and energy for still photography or not? I
do, but I don't. I'm afraid I'm guilty of letting it slip for weeks at a time. Like, I was so busy getting this new book done, although, it was good in a way because I had what I thought I had to do was take a new photograph for the cover. And although I did, and I worked on that quite a bit, I ended up not using that as a cover photograph. I did use it inside the book. But that was really fun because it was a challenge. It was a type of photography I'd never done before, which was taking a model out to one of our beautiful beaches here at sunset and capturing her with the sun going down behind her with a very colorful sky. And I thought that was going to be the cover, but when we looked at it and we kind of tested it and went back and forth, we decided that, one of my more classical photographs was better suited to the subject composition itself. But I do need to, Kirby, I gotta get out there and take some more pictures. I've been a little preoccupied with the book, and it's time to get out there and go for it again. The best way for me to take photographs is to go on a trip. because then I immerse myself in wherever it is, whether it's in the Grand Tetons or it's in Barcelona, traveling through Spain. When I'm traveling, I tend to really switch into photography mode and take a lot of photographs. It's time for me to do that again.
Same here. It's much easier, I find, also, if you're away from all your usual daily routine, to get into photography and get into it in a deep and meaningful way. So that's how I enjoy doing it as well.
For sure. Absolutely.
So what's your process for writing a book? How did you start? And do you do your own editing, or you have an editor? And
I have a publisher with an editor, and I find that to be really helpful, because otherwise it's difficult doing it all on your own. But the process is to write a really detailed table of contents. This is what works for me. Excuse me. When I write the table of contents, it's like the roadmap. And then I just sit down and write a chapter following the table of contents, send it to my editor. He'll send back certain notes. And sometimes I really don't want to read the notes, because by the time I get it back, I'm already into the next couple of chapters. So lately, I've taken a new approach, which is I don't address any of his notes. I read them, but I generally won't go back and make any major changes until I've completed the whole book. And then I go switch from writing mode to editing mode, because those are two different things. It's kind of similar to, again, you could say it's similar to being a still photographer or shooting video, where you're out shooting and you're just trying to capture everything. And then you go back in the studio and now you're editing, and that's very different. And then for these books, probably the equal to writing the book is getting all the images together, because those have to be very precise. And that can take a lot of time. So I've managed to, figure out the process of writing. And for me, once I figure something out, like I figured out video, I figured out how to shoot and edit, it becomes a real passion. So now that I really figured out, okay, this is my process for writing a book, then of course now I've got like 5 or 6 slated out that I want to write. And it's just a question of balancing my schedule to, keep going with the things I have to do. And writing a book is a lengthy process, and you're not going to see the result for some time. So it's a different kind of discipline than, say, I could go for a walk and shoot a great photograph, come back and edit it and put it up on Instagram and start getting feedback that same day. Well, when I write a book, I'm not going to hear anything back from people for months and months and months. So it requires a very different mindset and discipline, but I find it very rewarding, because by the same token, that book will live on a very long time. It doesn't just sort of disappear into the ether of the internet. And that's why I find myself focusing on that more and more.
so one of the big difficulties for a lot of authors these days is finding a publisher and getting the book published. How did you go about that?
I was fortunate that I had a publisher reach out to me, and they said they liked my interviews. Have you thought about putting it in writing? And I kind of let that email sit there for a long time. And then I got back to them, and I found they were a terrific publishing company called Mango Press. They're in Coral Gables, Florida. And they were specializing in people who had a pretty good footprint in terms of YouTube or social media. Because I think their theory was, look, you're already out there creating content. Why don't we just transition that into printed content? So they invited me on board, which was really fantastic. And interacting with a publisher is really important, because it's a creative process, especially, well, there's the editing stage and then there's the design stage. as photographers, we're really picky about how our photographs are going to be shown, right? And how everything has to look really perfect. And I'm fortunate in having a designer that I can work with easily, and it's a very good collaboration. But I have other work that I have self-published, and you can certainly do that. And in some ways, of course, it's easier because you don't have to go out and hunt for a publisher. So I think both of them, and then I have certain works that I may still self-publish. Like, for instance, I'm writing a workbook to go along with each of my books, which will basically take the reader and essentially teach them in a class style, like read this, give an example of that, watch this video. In other words, it takes them through like a checklist. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to self-publish those. But for me, it's been a really enjoyable experience working with a great publisher.
It would be wonderful if we all had that kind of relationship, I guess. So where do you see things headed with all this writing you're doing? Are you going to continue to be a video producer and director, or?
Right now, I'm sort of stepping back more into a producer role on my videos. I have invited 3 other creatives to produce on my channel. And one is a filmmaker, and 2 of them are portrait photographers. And I'm hoping that, that continues, because it allows me to sort of take a step back and produce them rather than having to shoot all the videos myself. And that's giving me some more time and space to pursue my writing. So that's the direction I'm going in. I see myself as, from here on out, concentrating more and more on writing. And I will be doing some more live workshops. I'm going to B&H at the end of May to do a workshop there. And I'm scheduling several others around and about in my local area, in the Silicon Valley area, because I do enjoy that a lot. And I will be creating online classes to go with my books. So those are the kinds of directions I'm heading in. And I do need to circle back to getting my work back into galleries. That'll be another stage once I kind of handle these immediate things. All that's going to keep me busy. So I'm not likely to run out of things to do for a while, Kirby.
Doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
So online courses seem to be the thing to do these days. What are your courses going to be about, and when do they become available?
Well, I'm writing the one that goes with my first book right now. I'm about halfway through it. It's basically going to augment the book with videos that I've already shot and a couple of new videos. So, for instance, what I mentioned to you about visualization, they'll not only read that chapter, but they'll also watch a couple of videos that will make it even easier to understand what that's all about. And then I'm going to tell them to do certain things like, okay, now go out and look at a piece of art and analyze it the way I've shown you. And then take that and now go out and take a new photograph and see the results. The main thing about teaching people this stuff is, first of all, they have to understand clearly what you're saying, and then they have to put it into use. Because if you just read a book and say, oh, that was cool, Mark, and put it down, nothing's going to happen. Imagine you read a cookbook and you never took one of those recipes and turned it into a meal. What's the point? So very early on in the book and throughout the course, I'm asking them to apply everything that I'm talking about step by step. So the online class will simply walk them through that in a kind of an easy way so they don't get overwhelmed. It's done gradually so that they can learn step by step, and at the end of the day come out as a much better photographer.
Yeah, I think that's one of the difficulties that amateur photographers, weekend photographers face is trying to get enough experience with their camera and with the different methodologies that you've talked about to actually make it part of them. And I think what you're doing should help a good bit.
That's my goal, and I want it to be an easy to follow, set of actions that they can, either get the workbook or go to an online classroom setting and actually get through it fairly easily.
Good. Well, it's been fun talking to you, Mark. Where can people find all these various endeavors?
Well, the easiest way to get my books is go to Amazon, just type my name in, Marc Silber, Marcsilber, and my books will pop up. And you can go to my website. Also, we've got some giveaways. We have a pre-release giveaway from my friends at Think Tank who are going to give a bag to one of the lucky pre-order people. And that's Silber Studios, again, spelled with a B, silberstudios.com, and you'll see there's a tab for the books. Those are probably the easiest ways to find those. And if you go to YouTube, you can see my videos. Again, type in Marc Silber, and my videos will pop up, and I think we're up to 350 of them-ish, something like that. So we've got a lot of variety there broken into different playlists. And I think you'll get a lot of useful information out of those videos.
And where do you plan to publish your courses? Is that going to be on your website or on one of the other hosting?
It's going to be it'll be on one of the major platforms, but it'll also be available, through my website. I just haven't decided which platform I'm using yet. I'm still evaluating that. So once I finish, I'm outlining the courses right now, but I'm going to try to finish that up in the next couple of months and get those going by summertime.
Okay, well, thanks again for being on the show, Mark, and thanks to all our listeners for tuning in again. This podcast is published on the 15th and 30th of each month. It can be found on iTunes as Photographing the West and on my website as www.flanaganphotos.com. And while you're at it, do me a favor and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Bye for now, then.
Thank you, Kirby.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.